On this episode of China Unscripted, Taiwan is about to have a new president, and we predict down to the second when China will invade. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jung.
And I'm Matt Canesta.
And joining us once again is Colonel Grant Newsham, a former Marine intelligence officer who's also lived in Taiwan as part of the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs Fellowship. He's also the author of the book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It took a little while because of the time delay from your undisclosed location. The Taiwan had an election. It's pretty big news. And, the CCP, they framed it as a choice between peace and war. What did the Taiwanese people choose?
Well, it looks like they want war. They were also offered a choice between like luxury or just misery.
Prosperity and decline. Yeah, that was the other part of it.
They chose the bad part in both cases. This is just, I think, a huge humiliation for the Chinese communists. They really were pulling out all stops and literally threatened the Taiwanese voters really with something like, well, vote for our guys or we'll kill you.
We'll destroy you, kill you, yeah.
It's a great way to win people over, and it didn't pay off for them. So I think what you're seeing really is the Beijing is, they're not going to admit it, but they recognize that they have no chance of ever getting Taiwan without either force or some just Olympian subversion. But they're not going to get it voluntarily.
It's amazing because this is such a different situation than it was, 10 years ago? Or more than that under Ma Ying-jeou.
No, yeah. I mean, I would say peak would have been somewhere between...
Wasn't it 2012 where Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping met in Singapore?
Was it 2012? Yeah, I think they were signing these trade deals, but then the Sunflower Revolution happened in Taiwan.
Sunflower, yeah. Yeah, I'm curious. What do you think was the turning point where the sort of economic slow takeover that the CCP wanted, when did that just get off the table such that the Taiwanese people now chose war and decline in the election?
It was that Sunflower movement that you just mentioned. And it was very interesting in this most recent election. Former President Ma, who you just mentioned, he was the guy who was selling out Taiwan during that period from 2008, 2016-ish. He gave an interview actually for Deutsche Welle in the German outlet just a few days before the election this year. And he basically said, yeah, I wasn't trying to defend Taiwan. Yes, I thought we should trust Xi Jinping. I wasn't trying to increase defense spending. And he laid out all these things, which were basically what you would do if you want to turn Taiwan over to China. And that included just pretty much opening up Taiwan economically to China, which means you'd have lost control of just about everything. And it was a lot of basically young Taiwanese who didn't like this and protested and brought that to a halt. The interview was so bad in terms of frightening that the KMT, which was Ma's party, they would not let him attend their last main rally, apparently, for fear of reminding people that he was something of a quisling.
Yeah, I mean, Hou You-yi had to come out and basically say, well, that's just his opinion.
The KMT candidate.
The KMT candidate had to come out and be like, well, it's Ma Ying-jeou doesn't speak for us.
Yeah.
Basically like a Big Lebowski, well, that's just your opinion, man.
Well, it is interesting because that shows even the more pro-engagement with China party still understands that what's in the water is you cannot be that overtly, yeah, let's unify with China.
Yeah, I mean, I think KMT said something during the election, right, about how they would not do unification talks with China and they would continue to build military ties with other countries in the region and the U.S. So it's a sea change from a decade ago.
It is clear that Taiwan is not interested in playing the CCP's game. What do you think the CCP's next move is going to be, considering they have been so thoroughly embarrassed, as you said?
Well, I think what they're going to do is they're going to lay off the military threats for a little while, not for very long, but for a little while. And I think they're going to take advantage of actually the one bit of good news from this election was that in the what amounts to the legislative election, that the KMT got a one-person majority, and the other opposition party, the TPP, they got 8 seats. So the Lai's party, the guy who won, they have 51 seats. So you can see that the opposition parties put together have a majority. And I think what China is going to do is to try to work with those parties. They never really work with anyone, but try to sort of subvert or use some of their friends in those parties to really obstruct Lai, the new president's efforts to do things like pass a budget, increase defense spending, put Taiwan's defense closer to the Americans, do training in America, buy military hardware, etc. So they're going to try and really slow roll or obstruct Lai's efforts to govern. So I fully expect them to do that. And I think that the political pressure, the political subversion, and the economic pressure is going to continue on Taiwan. But I think they'll hold off on the military sort of coercion, at least for a little while. As I said, I expect you'll see something pretty big by May, which is when the current president Tsai steps down and Lai is inaugurated. But China's objectives have not changed, and that is Xi Jinping intends to get Taiwan one way or another.
When you say something pretty big by May, what would you have in mind?
I think you'd probably see some larger exercises, exercising all parts of the PLA. The air, sea, ground, missiles, cyber, outer space, the works, and probably see some more of the sort of internal political warfare in Taiwan, where sympathizers, fifth columnists, proxies, say moguls who own media companies, start putting out disinformation and sort of propaganda designed to sort of discredit or weaken support for Taiwan's democracy and Lai and his party in particular. But say you'll see this on a bigger scale if you watch how the PLA's movements towards Taiwan have expanded steadily over the last couple years. They are now operating all around Taiwan with their naval, air, drone, the UAV, the sort of unmanned aerial vehicles. They're just like a symphony almost, an orchestra that's operating, is getting into place on all sides of Taiwan, operating even farther out to the east, which means if the Chinese Navy is operating east of Taiwan, and someone wants to get in to help them, you can see what the problems are. So I think you're just going to see bigger, more complex exercises done towards Taiwan, and that has a way of sort of numbing people, and not just in Taiwan, but in the U.S. and the rest of the free world, to this sort of military posturing and aggression towards Taiwan. And one day, if you're doing this all the time, one day all you have to do is say, well, this day is for real. Here we go. And you're probably going to get a jump on everybody who hasn't been really ready for it or expecting it, or who just assumed the Chinese are just acting out. So I think this is going to continue.
Well, speaking of sort of attacking Taiwan from the east, one of the things we have seen is that China has been rapidly expanding its presence in the Pacific Island nations. And as this election happened, we saw that Nauru suddenly switched allegiances from Taiwan to China.
It was like immediately after the election.
Immediately.
Oh, yeah, that was not a coincidence. It also shows you that the benefits of sort of being accommodating towards the PRC, as the Biden administration was, where President Biden was clear to say, well, we don't support independence for Taiwan, thinking that might calm down the Chinese and they might reciprocate with a little better behavior, but they didn't. And as you saw, Nauru, it's a small but a strategically important country in the Pacific, and it's one of only about 12 or 13 countries that even recognize Taiwan. it said, "Well, we're with China now. We no longer recognize Taiwan." It's a huge affront, more to the United States than to anyone else. But having a Chinese presence in Nauru, or they have not a military presence yet, but having China sort of in the driver's seat there, that is not something you want to see, especially when you look at everywhere else in the Pacific Islands where they have successfully insinuated themselves over the last 30 years. And one of the ironies here is that Nauru was really begging the United States for help over the last few years, at least. And even last summer, they were saying, please, can you do something for us? And the U.S. government couldn't be bothered, apparently busy with other things. And so finally, Nauru just said, well, that's that. If you're not going to help us, we'll go with you. And there was even a former Trump administration official who said, when we left office, we ran out of time, but we were trying to get a special agreement with Nauru, and so that it would be like the arrangements we have with Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, where we give a lot of financial aid and other support in exchange for defense rights in the country. And and the guy says, well, we recommended this to Biden's transition team, and they didn't want to do anything with it. They didn't want to upset the status quo. Well, the status quo has been upset, and that's what you get for really being slothful. So many of the problems in the Pacific where China's stolen a march on us are really the result of our own negligence.
Well, what kind of time frame are we looking at here? Because currently, even in the Solomon Islands, where we can put the Pacific Islands on the map so people have an idea of how this is sort of surrounding Taiwan. But even in the Solomon Islands, where China has a really big footprint, I am not aware of any actual military presence yet. If the goal is to attack Taiwan on multiple fronts or even to blockade it, it seems like there's still it would still take time to be able to get those facilities in place. So what's the time frame we're looking at?
Well, it all goes slowly. This Chinese sequence for inserting themselves somewhere, it starts with a commercial presence, which leads to political influence, and it's all greased with bribery. And then there's a security angle to it. It's always there, but they will take their time. And it comes so slowly sometimes that many people say, well, there's nothing to worry about. You see, the PLA isn't here. No, but not yet. But you do find that Chinese influence over the government and the elites is so strong that when the time comes, you will see the PLA make its presence felt. Solomon Islands, they've got the Chinese police there already in force. And when the time comes, you'll see the PLA out there. But for purposes of going after Taiwan, you don't have to have the PLA set up all over the Pacific. It's very helpful to have these with some sort of an alignment with these islands, not least for political support. But with what the PLA, what the Chinese military can do right now, it is capable of isolating Taiwan and making it tough for us to get in to help them. So they don't actually have to occupy the Pacific yet. And that's part of a larger game, which ultimately involves having the People's Liberation Army, the Navy and Air Force in particular, operating throughout the Pacific, all the way to the west coast of Latin America, off the U.S. West Coast as well. And they've given 5-10 years, and they will have the ships, the submarine and the aircraft and the basing facilities to do this. They've already set up the port and airfield infrastructure in Latin America, Central America too, where when the time comes, they'll be operating out of there. But for purposes of the immediate threat to Taiwan, for now, it's the political support and the political influence, along with the presence of Chinese in all of the Pacific Islands, that's enough for now. And do keep in mind that the Chinese fishing fleet operating in the Pacific, to include lots of maritime militia, these double-hulled, high fast fishing boats that are armed as well. These can handle anti-ship missiles quite easily, as can any Chinese freight container ship. And I think when the time comes, we may find ourselves losing U.S. Navy ships from missiles fired from what looked like fishing boats, container ships as well. But as I said, Taiwan is so close to China that they can reasonably think they've got a shot at it militarily already.
Well, so Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, the private military contractors, said in a recent interview that he thinks that the timeline for the invasion could be this spring, 2024, which would be, I mean, essentially even maybe before William Lai takes power. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, could be. This is all a bit like predicting who's going to win the Super Bowl. And every September, I tell you it's going to be the Washington football team by whatever name. And one of these years I'm going to be right. But so there's a lot of predictions. But this is not unreasonable. I think the PLA is already capable of having a pretty good shot at Taiwan. It could be then maybe later in the year. Maybe a year or two, and some people say it's 10 years from now. There was a retired Navy admiral who comments a lot, who's rather thin on Asia experience, but he claims America has a 10-year grace period. Now that is kicking the can down the road pretty darn far, and I don't think we've got that. What do I think? My guess would be that she is watching to see what happens in Taiwan, though I think he kind of knows that Taiwan is not going to come into his arms willingly, even if the opposition cooperates with him more than they might. But I think he's going to look at what happens in the United States, because we have an election coming, and this is going to be rough. Our elections are always chaotic, but this is going to be something different, I think. It brings to mind the last election. But worse, and I think we are going to have rioting in the streets, these dial-up mobs, and with some people from some part of the political spectrum actually encouraging them. And this is going to cause chaos. It's going to distract us. And I almost say, regardless of who wins, these things might not stop, and the chaos might not stop. So if America is distracted, looking inwards, got its own problems to deal with, Xi Jinping just might think, well, they probably don't have enough bandwidth to do anything if I make a move on Taiwan. So if you asked me if I would make a wager, I would probably put a little money that you might get an attack or some sort of serious assault or serious use of force, maybe end of the year rather than spring. But once again, it's a prediction. It's an estimate. But I think they are capable. And I would say it depends on what happens in the United States as much as anything else.
Well, currently Xi Jinping is in the middle of a pretty far-reaching purge, an anti-corruption campaign, as he calls it, in the PLA, particularly the Rocket Force. Recently, there was also some U.S. intelligence that came out that there are Chinese missiles filled with water instead of fuel. Do you think Xi Jinping feels the PLA is in a position where it could be a fighting force right now?
I think he does. That report about missiles full of water, I think that has been pretty well discredited. There's been something strange going on in the last few months in the U.S. amongst the commentariat, where all sorts of people have been saying there's nothing to worry about when it comes to China and Taiwan. The PLA is not ready. Xi doesn't want to. He can't do it. He's got corruption, economy, etc. And I don't know what's going on, but it is. I don't think it's a coincidence. For some reason, there's this threat deflation going on, and I can't make sense of it. Exactly why it is. I just can't. I don't know. I could probably speculate if I gave the matter more thought. But you do notice this. And you would think that there's absolutely nothing to worry about from the PRC, but I see it very differently. And these the officers and officials who've been removed, it could be that it does that the whole thing is just a sort of a rotten house of just a rotten edifice, but it could just be he's getting his guys in place. He's getting people he likes, people he can trust. If the complaint is corruption, it's always a little odd because everybody's corrupt at that level in China. He'd have like 6 people left in his officer corps if corruption was the standard. But you look at what they actually do when they're training and their exercises, and you look at the hardware they have, And you've really got to take it very seriously, to my way of thinking. Yes, he has problems. I think every country, and really even every dictator, has always had problems. But that doesn't always seem to deter them or stop them from doing something they really want to do. I had one friend of mine who actually looks closely at the 1930s. Now, he's pointed out that with the Germans, Hitler was doing the same thing. He was removing officers for this and that, and people were saying, "Well, he's just not able to attack because of the same things that you're hearing now." And I think that can be rather dangerous if we do think that way. We do have to be prepared, I think, for the worst. And it's just my assessment, looking at sort of what the Chinese have, what they're doing with it, um, that I'm very concerned about it.
So, do you think a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is inevitable, or can it still be stopped or prevented?
Oh, I think it can be stopped. I don't even think it's all that hard to stop it. You just have to make the cost much too high. And one thing that you do have to do is make the cost personal for guys like Xi Jinping and that ruling elite in China. And I think we've talked about this before. You've got to make it clear that they're going to lose everything if they make a move. That means all their wealth, all their overseas real estate, overseas bank accounts, all their great relatives with green cards. That is all going to disappear. China's going to lose all of its overseas interests. It doesn't have the ability to protect them yet. So most of its trade will stop, except for with North Korea and maybe Russia and Iran. But with the rest of the world, most of that will stop. They're going to have trouble getting food, getting oil, and they will just be a pariah forever. But making it for a very long time, but making it personal, I said, for the top dogs, that would go a long way. But also, we tend to think of a military response as the only response, or we often do. And we do need a military that can, if necessary, sink the PLA in an afternoon. We could have that if we had the necessary hardware, and were properly sized and rebuilt our Navy, rebuilt our militaries. So you do have to have the military part of it right. And we need to sort of improve ourselves fairly quickly if we can. But at the same time, if you revoke the People's Bank of China's ability to operate in US dollars or to operate in the United States, that would put a big damper on Chinese capabilities. Make it hard for Wall Street to funnel money into China. Stop funding the PRC. Stop funding them with that convertible currency, with the dollars they must have. Really crack down on technology exports, other business dealings with China, and you can make life, say, pretty miserable for them if you do those things. But if you don't do them, of course, it makes it a lot easier for them. So what you do is you make it very hard for China, not just if they were to go after Taiwan, and at least for a couple more years, we could give them all the trouble that they want. But you want to make it costly on other fronts, and as I said, especially you want the top dogs to suffer, because too often in these kind of regimes that they don't mind, they'll sacrifice 1 million of their own people for something or other. But if you make it so they're sacrificing themselves, it tends to make them act a bit differently. But very often, just showing that you're serious and that you will stand up to this kind of regime, and that you have the capability to do it. It just can't be talk. You can stop it that way. You might ask, well, why didn't, for example, why didn't America go after Cuba? Why didn't we take out Castro? We could have done it any time and pretty quickly, but you think of all the other problems that would have led to. That was one reason we didn't do it. And similarly, while China may have a military advantage when it comes to a certain type of conflict against Taiwan, you make it so there's so much other trouble that they will experience that they just won't do it. That's really sort of one way to look at it, because I've noticed one commentator, not just one, but a lot of them say, well, the Chinese are too powerful. There's nothing we can do for Taiwan. Well, I've just laid out a few things that we can do. So that's, I'm not quite as negative or pessimistic as I might sound.
Yeah, one of the things that we've been doing is more recently doing training by sending Marines into Taiwan, U.S. Marines into
Just
Taiwan.
for clarity, we have not been doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
In case people were
in case
confused
people
about
were
our
confused.
force
I was
Marines.
spearheading as a non-serviceman myself. I was but you are a Marine colonel and a former intelligence officer. Tell us about what the U.S. is doing in terms of the Marine interaction with Taiwan's military.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I have to admit that a lot of it is actually the U.S. Army doing it too. They sometimes do good work. In fact, they're doing very good work. There's now a fair number of advisors, trainers in Taiwan has been reported. It's not like thousands. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's not huge. But it's more than it used to be. And it used to be you probably could have fit all of them into your studio, and they could have like spread out with room to spare. But there's more of them, and they are actually getting out and about, training and advising Taiwan's military. And I gather that there's going to be Taiwan troops, and in fact, there already are troops training in Michigan with the National Guard, U.S. Army National Guard, and apparently up to battalion size in the future. And that's a pretty big number of people. And the importance of this is not just it helps them learn some new tactics and techniques and ways of doing things, but also it breaks that isolation, that 40 plus years of isolation where the Americans really wouldn't have anything to do with the Taiwanese other than tell them that we love them. But we didn't want to be seen in public with them because China would be angry. So what sort of a message did that send Taiwan, both the government, the people of Taiwan, but also the Taiwan military? They were pretty much were like a baseball team that had never played a game. All they ever did was do these intra-squad games against each other, but they didn't have the experience that comes of actually getting out and doing your job. And now we're getting Americans in there dealing with them, and that makes a big difference. Plus, you do run, if you are an enemy, say mainland China, and you've got Americans around, and then China starts throwing its weight around. Once you start killing or hurting Americans, then it's a very different equation. It's harder for an administration in Washington to overlook that. But the significance of this really is not just operational in terms of improving capabilities, but psychologically. We're breaking that isolation that was essential. And now we just have to do more of it. Say, get the Taiwanese Navy and Marines out to Guam, Saipan, for example, and have them do some amphibious training with the U.S. Navy and Marines, and maybe the Japanese will join in. Under some circumstances, they will exert themselves. The Australians might even send up their ship. And you never know. But it's a big change, and it's a good thing. By itself, it isn't enough, but it is one piece of the puzzle, and it's about time. It is interesting that the U.S. Congress had been calling for this in the National Defense Authorization Act. So they pass every year and they've been calling for it since at least 2016 that I remember, was for the Americans to do joint training with the Taiwanese. And the Pentagon just ignored it, apparently thinking when Congress says they want you to do something, you don't really have to. State Department said the same thing about it. Well, it's just the sense of Congress, so we'll do what we want. And in the meantime, you had the Americans really just giving the Taiwanese the cold shoulder, and they wonder why the Taiwanese military isn't all it should be. They wonder why the Taiwanese government doesn't put all sorts of resources into defense. Well, maybe it has something to do with us not helping them out. I've mentioned this before, and it's our treatment of Taiwan was kind of like if you had a girlfriend and you told her, yeah, look, baby, I love you, and but you don't mind if you see me in public, pretend you don't know me because there's this other gal, and she'd get angry if she saw me with you. Well, I would suggest that your girlfriend isn't going to be all that convinced that you actually do love her, and that's sort of how we were with Taiwan. But we're finally waking up, and that is a good thing. That the one thing last thing I'll note is that I would recommend that we actually give Taiwan a free trade agreement, because so much of Taiwan's problems have to do with their economy, and let them have a free trade agreement with the United States, bolster their economy, and you're going to find the effects are very nice. So that should be something that should be done in addition to the additional military support that we are providing Taiwan.
Well, I think the CCP would love that. I mean, the United States opening up a free trade agreement with one of their provinces, how could they find any fault with that?
Well, nothing to complain about that I can think of. But of course, there is a little bit. But how do you argue with that? You can complain about us giving weaponry, etc. But how do you complain about economic support? And that is it's part of the dynamic in Taiwan, is that while people may not want to be part of mainland China, and most people do not, they also want, particularly young people, want to have decent jobs that pay well. They want to be able to maybe buy a house or an apartment someday. And if your economy is kind of lagging in that regard, well, you're going to vote for people who say they're going to do that, and that just happens to be is often the opposition parties. So people do often vote on their economic circumstances, and they say we have not taken up this opportunity. And even the Trump administration, which was the best on Taiwan to date, they didn't move on a free trade agreement with Taiwan. And I saw a quote from the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, and they said, well, we were just too busy, trying to deal with China economically. And it sort of makes one think that maybe government employees don't know what the word work overtime means or work on weekends. But if they had wanted to, they could have done it. But they didn't. And that was a lost opportunity. And it really it bolsters our friends. The DPP administrations, if they can say, look, we've made the economy a lot better. So that's we have opportunity to excel on that front as well.
Well, I would like to return to the election now, because that made me think of this. Taiwan voted for William Lai and his DPP party. And that's kind of taken as a clear sign that the Taiwanese people are not interested in closer relations with the PRC. However, the DPP did lose its majority in the parliament. KMT and TPP both got more seats. What's going on there? Because that seems to be kind of sending the opposite message. Why did so many Taiwanese people vote that way in the parliament?
Well, that's how China spun it, in fact. After the results, they said, well, look, a majority of people didn't vote for the DPP. Therefore, they really do love the Chinese or the Chinese communists. Well, not so fast. That's how politicians of all stripes will spin it. But many people, and I'll take the TPP, which is sort of a newish third party. A lot of their voters are younger people, and they voted for somebody other than the DPP, and often vote because they see corruption in government. They see government doesn't seem to work all that well, and their economic conditions haven't really gotten all that much better during the DPP administrations. And so they think, well, we're going to vote for somebody else. And the TPP presents itself as a newish party that actually will look after those people's interests. So it attracts attracted a pretty good size of 28%. It was a fair number of voters. And that, but the vote was not sort of a pro-PRC vote. It was as much just let's try something different and see how it goes. Within the KMT itself, that's where you're going to find the real sort of soft on China people. But even within the KMT, there's a lot of people who don't want to be part of the PRC. So the voting is, as I said, is often done on economic grounds, people's personal situation. And probably the true figure of people who sort of voted against the PRC in this election would be well over 60%, I think one would fairly argue. And as time goes on, the KMT's support base is often a lot of older people. And just the nature of things, as time goes on, these older people move on to other pastures. And you're not going to have as many pro-PRC people in Taiwan. They're just China and Taiwan are on diverging tangents, and Taiwan is not getting any closer to the PRC, and it's just getting farther away from it. But as I say, that third party, particularly the TPP, if you read that carefully, that it's not. I think most of those people, when it comes to do the relationships with China, would be closer to the DPP than they would to anything else.
So when it comes to the presidential election, a lot of people look at it like it's like a Ross Perot situation where this third party suddenly comes in and then splits the vote between the two major parties, but the split is uneven. So essentially, the result is they sabotage one party and help the other party. Do you think that if the TPP were not involved in this election, that we would have still seen a majority support for the DPP, specifically because you mentioned a lot of people's, anti-PRC stance?
I think it would have been closer. I can at least say that. In terms of who would have won, I don't know. I just don't know about that. But one thing that's an interesting sort of development during the election campaign was that the TPP and the KMT, and once again, the KMT is the pretty soft on China party, and the TPP is that third party. They tried to present a unity ticket, which means that their top guy the top guy in each party was going to be sort of run as president and vice president candidates. They couldn't decide on who was going to be the top dog. And as a result, that broke up. And it was like apparently on live TV when they realized that this wasn't going to happen. And that turned a lot of people off, apparently. But that whole thing, it was apparently arranged by the Chinese communists. That there's what I consider compelling circumstantial evidence to suggest that China was actually trying to dictate that. And the KMT are the ones who really thought this was a splendid idea, less so the TPP. And the communists even got a fourth candidate, Terry Goh, the head of Foxconn, that he was going to run, and they actually encouraged him not to run by investigating his companies in China. So you had the communists successfully exerting their influence within the Taiwanese electoral system, almost to determine who was going to be the candidates. As I said, so this was something that got a lot of attention, and it certainly was interesting. If those two parties had run together, I think they would have won.
What is that evidence that you see that the CCP may have been behind that unity ticket idea?
There were some people from the KMT who went to China and had some meetings with Chinese officials. And it's not all that hard to figure out what happened. And former President Ma was throwing his weight around as well. It seems to be fairly sort of taken as something that did happen. And what happened to Terry Goh, that is pretty easy to figure out. There's been some people who've said that he is very close to the Chinese Communist Party to start with. Some have said that. But when it comes to the pressure they were applying on his companies, that was public knowledge. And shortly after, he decided politics wasn't his thing this year.
Do you think that the TPP side was aware of this intrigue between the KMT and the CCP?
I think so. It's one of my theories is that if I know something, I suspect that just about everyone else does too. But I would think that they did. But you just couldn't. You wondered how it was going to work, just because you don't get to be the top candidate of a party by having zero ego. And you just we're just waiting to see, okay, who's going to go first, or say, I'll go, you go, I'll go second. That just doesn't seem to happen all that often. But there was that problem too, that when the TPP saw that it might have to play second fiddle to the KMT, that they were starting to get so much pressure and trouble from their own supporters that I think they backed off pretty quickly.
Well, you basically have two men with big egos who have to decide like which one of them is going to be the alpha, and they both want to be the alpha, right? So
I mean,
there's just no...
especially wen-je, the TPP candidate, basically built the TPP party, right?
Right.
He founded the Taiwan People's Party essentially in large part so he could run for president.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's his baby. He's not going to give it up.
Yeah, I mean, two men with power and ego, and Tsai Ing-wen is just this woman in the middle trying to... I feel like that I can relate to this situation somehow.
That analogy would work better if William Lai was...
Well, I know that's why I had to go back to
Tsai Ing-wen.
It didn't go great.
Well, he's got Xiaobi Kim.
So you mentioned the election interference, and it's transparent. There's a variety of ways the CCP tried to influence this election that they had a pretty big stake in. You also mentioned that, there is this election coming up in the U.S. this year that a lot is riding on for China as well. Is there any sense that the Chinese Communist Party is going to try to influence the election in some way? I'm trying to phrase this in a way that won't get YouTube to cancel the show.
I mean, I don't think so, Chris. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, I doubt they will, but if they did, they'd perhaps do something like support some of these groups that were rioting back in 2020, like they just might have done. That's one thing. They've also got their friends on Wall Street and in the U.S. business class. You saw the two standing ovations that Xi Jinping got in San Francisco last November. Well, it shows you that they've got some friends who are influential, and it is that donor class which has a lot of influence in U.S. politics. Additionally,
I will say, though, that it does seem... You mentioned the Apex standing ovation. That was awful. But then you also see guys like Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan saying, yeah, the China investment was not as good as I thought it was. You see a lot of Wall Street guys moving out of China. So is that really a faction the Chinese Communist Party can rely on anymore?
I think it still is. Jamie Dimon's always the head of JP Morgan. He's always sort of been willing to sort of speak up a bit, but when it suits his purposes. But I'm not sure that he's representative of everybody on Wall Street. I think they've got a ways to go before they get that 2x4, on the side of the head and wake up. I'm not sure that, say, they've completely woken up just yet. In the U.S. business class as well, those two standing ovations, and it was that said plenty. So I think they still have plenty of friends in Wall Street, on Wall Street, the business class as well, but also in the political class. There's you see all sorts of people who are saying, "Don't provoke China. Keep the status quo. Let's engage. We have to talk with them. We have to, understand things. We're having financial talks going on between our financial officials and theirs, presumably to help the Chinese out of their financial mess. The U.S. military has been keen to engage with the Chinese." You even had the Secretary of State say the other day, well, China's helping us out with fentanyl. They're going after the people who are exporting it to America. I used to be a lawyer, and you'd love to have a sort of a witness on the stand. You'd ask him, well, were you lying then or are you lying now? He couldn't possibly believe this, but you have people saying this. So there is these are sort of proxies. They can be second or third level proxies, but they're effectively saying, let's not challenge the Chinese. And this other candidate who's coming, who knows what he would do. So that's one form of influence. But also you do have, academia, which is a lot of people who are very supportive of the PRC in it. Obviously the use of TikTok, social media to pass messages, disinformation, to attack the people's minds. This cognitive warfare, the Chinese are very good at it. When the TikTok CEO testified before Congress some months back, it was well, his testimony wasn't a surprise, but what was most interesting was that phalanx of Americans, lawyers and lobbyists behind him, just lined up in a row. And those are the guys who are doing China's bidding to make sure that TikTok has free access to American minds. If the price is right, I think there's a certain type of American who will do all sorts of things and convince himself that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, TikTok really is scary because a lot of young people, that's their primary source of news and information. And it's controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. That's not good.
I remember how there were complaints from mainstream media back 20 years ago that young people were watching The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and that's where they were getting their news from. And there was this real concern, oh, this is so terrible that they're getting their news from there. And it is in hindsight, that was so much better than TikTok, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. And I'm not exactly tech savvy, but even I kind of know that if I had the ability to sort of have 24/7 access to people's minds, even I might be able to convince them of something. And I would also note along these lines of, it's not, is it election interference? I'm not so sure, but it does support voting, is that you've even got in, say, the US military, there's almost a class that goes out of its way to sort of not see China as a threat, to not take the necessary measures to take them on. And that is ultimately, it's sort of a very successful bit of psychological warfare on the part of the PRC.
Well, on that note, we saw after the election a lot of U.S. media framing it like Taiwan voted for William Lai, angering China. We've seen that over the years. A lot of everything is framed as, does it or does it not anger China?
Everything is angering China. You don't see a headline that says not angering China.
China's very happy today.
Yeah. There's one particular news outlet, and I won't say their name. Every headline they've got starts off, in a move likely to anger China, America did this. And that is pretty much how we do characterize things. And with this election in Taiwan, the headline should have been 23 million people mostly of Chinese origins have a free, fair, honest election and can choose their own leaders, cast the rascals out and vote some new rascals in. And why exactly can't they do it 90 miles away on the mainland? That is what really the most impressive thing about all of this is, and why part of the reason why China's so scared is because it's really an existential threat, and it gives a lie to everything that China says about, and everything Jackie Chan says about Chinese people needing to be handled toughly with a boot on the neck. But how many headlines did you see just praising this exhibit of democracy, consensual government? Very few. Which is not how it should be.
I do think mainstream media should use rascals more often.
Scoundrels
when they report it. Scoundrels, ne'er-do-wells.
Ne'er-do-wells.
Thank you,
Yeah,
I mean,
that one.
So given that everything angers China, right? I mean, the U.S. political system has been afraid to take moves that would anger China, even if they support Taiwan, right? And so do you think, though, that whether it's this election or further U.S. moves to anger China, or that anger China, does angering China make them more likely to invade?
No, they're always a pretty foul mood. If you don't do what the Chinese communists want, well, they're unhappy. And even if you do what they want, you probably haven't done well enough, so they'll be unhappy about that as well. But you'd think by now, after all these years of empirical evidence, that there is nothing to be gained by trying to placate the People's Republic of China. You'd be hard-pressed to construct an argument along those lines. And what you really have to do is defend your own interests, defend freedom, defend your friends, stand up for them, and not do anything that is going to help your antagonist. But it's almost as if we don't learn and intentionally trying not to. But really, if we were to surrender tomorrow, I'm sure China would complain about the way we surrendered. So there's really nothing to be gained on that front, as I see it.
I mean, what if it was like a really big move, like the U.S. calls Taiwan an independent country and then also installs a naval base on the coast of Taiwan? Like, that's going to anger China, obviously, but like, is that enough to trigger a war?
Well, you never know. It would make them pretty darn mad. And that's what comes of ignoring a sort of a problem for this long. It's a bit like not going to the dentist when your tooth hurts, instead just taking a shot of vodka. By the time you really need to go to the dentist, it's a problem that is not easily solved.
And you're drunk.
That's the upside. But
helps with the pain of the root canal.
But those are things that obviously they would not be taken lightly by the PRC. But if sometimes it's a choice between bad choices, and when it does come to this recognition of Taiwan legally and just by every measure of sort of what our legal requirements are, what international law allows, what precedent and former practice tells us, is there's no reason America could not recognize both Beijing and Taiwan. There is no reason we can't do that, other than China would be angry. But so we could do that. Putting a base in Taiwan, well, maybe at some point it will come to that. There's ways to sort of have something like a base without actually having a base. But ultimately, it comes down to making it clear to the other side that this is our core interest, and if you want to do something about it, we're willing to go as far as you want. If you don't do that, then the party that is willing to go a little farther is always going to have the upper hand. But if you're always going to back down, you can expect to ultimately be backed into a corner from where there isn't much escape. But those two things that should have been done a long time ago, both the recognition and some real military support for Taiwan. And if we'd done it then, you wouldn't need this root canal times 10.
I mean, I've had this idea that the U.S. should go to Beijing and say, look, we're going to recognize Taiwan as a country. Would you like us to recognize them as the one true China? Or would you like us to recognize them as a separate independent country and maintain our ties with you? And Beijing will not like either of those choices. But like essentially, how do you think that would play out?
Oh, I think the word incandescent would come to mind. You've got to also keep in mind that you've got to raise the costs to them, to these people. And as I said, you've got to make these costs personal. And maybe at the same time, you could provide a list of the billions of dollars, say, once again, the top 50 guys in the CCP have got stashed away overseas. You recall how panicked they were in 2012-ish when a couple of U.S. Media companies did some excellent reporting and uncovered the overseas holdings of some of the top dogs, including the toppest dog. And they were furious about this. And that's the one thing that scared them. So you've really got to be able to play rough. And I'm not sure that we've got the nerve for it right now. So, it could be done, but it wouldn't be easy. And once again, all this stuff would have been a lot easier if you'd done it 15 years ago. And there were people saying, let's do it 15 years ago. And they were, of course, not exactly lauded for their foresight.
Clearly, what we need is a charismatic, blonde president who's tough on China winning this next election. Obviously, I'm talking about Matt Canazda running for president in 2024.
Well,
that job.
We've never had a president with a mustache since, I don't know, a long time.
Maybe like Taft.
Taft.
Oh, yeah.
We need a president.
I could be the next Taft.
We need a president with the mutton chops to go after China.
I believe that would be Chester A. Arthur.
Greatest president.
Guy with an ascot, Buchanan. But that'll work.
That's my best idea.
I mean, in terms of, and you brought this up a little bit earlier about the U.S. election, but do you think that there are things that the U.S. could learn from Taiwan's election?
Oh, goodness, yes. They really do it well. You'll notice that the results came out in about 2 hours, whereas with us, it seems like a year or two before we even get the results sorted out. It's very fast. But it's a good, simple system. It's all paper based. There's no absentee ballots, there's no vote by mail. You make the effort to show up and vote. And then the counting is all done in public, it's all paper. And there's people there watching every vote as it is counted. And they somehow do it right. Their elections are just as fiercely fought as ours. But they've are a demonstration really of how consensual government works. And they've one might say, well, they're just 23 million people. Yeah, we've got a lot more, but there's no reason that some of these basic things that they do can't be done. One thing I like about their system, and it's controversial, is that for about 10 days before the actual voting, you can't either do polling or announce polling. So you don't have this constant, like up to the last 20 seconds of what the polling is. And it seems to, I don't know, maybe it adds to a little more reflection on the part of the voting public. But they've also got about 70%, so like a 70+% voting rate, which this year was actually lower than it's been in the past.
Yeah, I mean, one of the complaints about the Taiwanese election system is because you have to go in person in your own district, which
Actually,
may mean
you have
traveling.
to go usually back to your hometown.
Your hometown.
It's almost very biblical.
Well, so because of that, like there is, I would say you could argue there's less enfranchisement or more disenfranchisement, which is a big word used in the U.S. elections. That you disenfranchise people if you don't make it easy for them to vote, because there have been truly so many historical problems with voting in the U.S., in particular African Americans, and also, earlier than that, it was like, whites who don't have land. So, how does Taiwan handle that enfranchisement issue?
Well, it's as I say, it seems to work when you get 70% plus of the voting of the voters out. So it seems to work. It's our system. We've had all sorts of problems, of course, and even we still do. But these basic things that come to along with the transparency in the process. That's somewhere where we could learn a lot from them, I think. Also, the media it's pretty open media in Taiwan. So it's not like you have some of the key outlets or social media groups or organizations saying, well, certain ideas can be heard, others cannot because they're misinformation. The Taiwan does a pretty good job of making sure that the voters are as well informed as they possibly can be, which is a key part of an electoral process, which tends to get, once again, that too gets overlooked a lot.
Do people there question whether the vote count is legitimate?
I've never heard any complaints about it. Keep in mind, they've only had elections for about 30 years now. But I've never heard any complaints about that. And when you have, when the counting is done in public, they empty the box on a table and hold it up and people can see it. It makes it it's hard to argue with that. The French went to something like this not all that long ago, made it all paper-based, and that is something that it works pretty well, and oftentimes the simpler the better. I would say it's I think we've got overall not a bad system, but it's so complex that there's parts of it that are parts of it that would rather not see the light of day or have light exposed on how things are run, and then other parts that are just as clear and simple as Taiwan. But to say it's that example of Taiwan voting is the thing that if America had people who did political warfare, they would be running wild with this. The obvious question, well, if Taiwan could do it, why couldn't you, Beijing?
I do think
because China has too many people, but please ignore India.
Yeah.
I do think we were in Taiwan in January 2020, and anybody can go to somewhere and watch the vote count, right? So You could see people bringing their kids to watch the vote count, and anytime somebody saw somebody make a mistake, because they announce it, they don't just count it in front of people and show everybody the paper, but then they tally it in front of everybody. So if somebody says the wrong name or something, like 10 people will be like, wait, that's, it was the other guy. So I think that's when you have that system and you grow up with that system, probably you're not questioning the vote count, but you do have to, travel. Sometimes people fly back to Taiwan to vote because that is the only way. There's no overseas voting because there is no absentee voting. So, there are, sacrifices to be made for that system.
Yeah, and we, of course, have a lot of military people overseas. How do you deal with that? You can't just tell them, well, tough. There's ways to sort of work it out. But you say I've been impressed with how the Taiwanese have done this.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me you could just do the exact same system on a military base, have everyone vote and publicly count it out, and then just send the result back.
Yeah,
solved. I solved the problems.
Actually, Taiwan has solved the problem.
Shut up, Matt. I'm not voting for you anymore.
But it actually is also interesting. There was a story that came out in Taiwan the day of the election where suddenly places were selling out of train tickets to go. And the thought was that because, Grant, as you mentioned, there is no polling, like polling is illegal for 10 days before the election. So people try to look at other indicators for what party is doing well. So they would look at how big the rallies were and how enthusiastic the rallies were. So there was it's just a supposition, really. There's no way to prove this, but like people were saying that maybe the train tickets were sold out because suddenly people realized that, maybe the who gets to be president isn't as inevitable as they thought it was based on the rallies, because the TPP especially had a really big, enthusiastic crowd at their rally. And then the reality of this third-party candidate maybe becoming the next president scared a lot of people into going back home to vote.
I remember definitely in 2020, like we went to a KMT rally and we went to a DPP rally. And even though the DPP did win that election, I would say the KMT rally was way more enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
a friend of mine went to just this last election, was at one, and he said the same thing. They were raucous. He said they all did go home earlier. They left before the rally ended, actually. A lot of them did as well. But also one part of the Taiwan equation is there's a lot of Taiwanese who live in China, particularly doing business there. And there's always reports of the Chinese government paying people to go back to Taiwan to vote. So it's just part of the equation. I don't believe it's shaped the outcome of it. But there's some respects. There's this idea of, when I vote, I go get in line. And to me, it's that making the effort, which is something that, is part and parcel of being a citizen. So that's just me.
I think also people don't have to work on election day in Taiwan, and the polls close at 4:30. So it's a different system in terms of like polls don't have to be open till 8 or 9 for people to like try to go home and vote after working.
No wonder their economy isn't as good as America's.
One just since you mentioned the Taiwan economy, and it does show, it factors into the voting, is that it is the economy. If you, in one sense, is doing pretty well, but in terms of the way money is spread out, that's where the problem is. That salaries are incredibly low there. There's a lot of money floating around, but it isn't distributed quite the way it ought to be. And as I said, real estate prices are just through the roof, and it's demoralizing for a lot of young Taiwanese. So shouldn't be surprised if they go with a third-party candidate, but that doesn't mean that they want to live in the People's Republic of China.
Well, yeah, if the young people want the wealth redistributed differently, I'm sure the Chinese Communist Party would have some suggestions.
To distribute more of it to the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, ultimately.
I mean,
but they wouldn't say that.
Well, no, but it's hardly like mainland China is not a beacon of high wages and low real estate prices. So if that's the concern.
Or massive wealth gaps.
Yeah, I mean, China's wealth gap is much greater than Taiwan's wealth gap.
And the U.S.
Yeah.
But I mean, hey, that doesn't get in the propaganda.
Chris, did you know that the Chinese Communist Party has lifted 700 million people out of poverty that they absolutely did not create themselves?
We just did something on how there's like 1 billion poor people in China recently. So much for that statistic. Well, Grant, great to have you back on the podcast. I really hope we don't have to call you in like a couple of months and be like, hey, well, they invaded. What's your thoughts?
Well, if you want to learn more about Grant's thoughts, is there some kind of book that people can go to?
Ooh.
Well, there's an excellent book that people can go to. In fact, I just happen to have one right here called When China Attacks, but came out last year. But it's an excellent book. It's available wherever books are sold, I guess. Also, I'm on Twitter with @NewshamGrant, and I have a website of sorts, www.grantnewsham.com, which will link up to the stuff I write.
And that book, does it have any like practical advice for people? Like, I don't know, maybe good news sources about China that they should follow?
Not really, but no, it does have one. But no,
Yeah?
I'm genuinely resentful. So I was laying into the U.S. government's sort of lack of a political warfare effort, and I suggested that they might listen to these 3 people up in the Empire State, up in New York. Look at how they do things if they want to see how it works. And I do mention China Uncensored as well. And I wasn't being nice. When I'm president or when I get my position, I'm going to disband this group called the GEC at the State Department and give you guys all the money.
Ooh, you bought my vote.
Democracy in action.
I understand it now. Well, thanks, Grant. Always a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure we'll have you on again soon. Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Should I feel bad about how quickly my vote was bought? I mean, it's my vote. I can do with it what I want.
Yes. I mean, I think that everyone's vote is bought to some degree, right? Even if it's not with money. It's like you buy my vote with promises of economic development.
Charisma.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about how we never predicted down to the second when Taiwan was going to be invaded. Like you promised in the intro.
Oh no. You mean, does that mean that people who make wild predictions about very specific things have no idea what they're talking about?
Or don't care if those predictions never come to fruition?
Yeah. It's all about once the views have been viewed, they can't be unviewed.
So this entire thing was a social media experiment, is what you're saying?
Yes, thank you for participating in our social media experiment. Leave an angry comment. It doesn't matter if you're angry. It feeds the algorithm because it's engagement.
I feel like the algorithm pretty much feeds off of anger.
Yes.
Or engagement.
The algorithm is the dark side. Oh, wow. I have seen through the looking glass. Anger, fear, resentment.
But
my God.
Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Suffering leads to winning elections?
Yes. And really, isn't that what matters, Shelley?
I mean, I do think that you see people voting out of frustration and anger. That definitely happens.
Yeah.
Usually with the economy.
Right. I mean, even the candidate people vote for, it's like, ugh, I hate everybody, but this guy's the least bad.
I don't know if that's always true. I mean,
it's sometimes true.
When you're running, I said, well, okay, yeah, that's true.
Look, if I'm running for president and you vote for me.
Do you think he caught that, Shelley?
I was going to say, if you want to hate vote for me, then I will accept that.
You will take that for the engagement. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes. This will all be solved when I'm supreme leader and there will be no more democracy or voting.
And then you'll execute the former presidents, Matt Gnezda.
Mm-hmm. And everyone else have been very open about the killing fields when I'm supreme leader.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chong.
And for now, at least, I'm Matt Gnezda.
We'll talk to you next time.